Enterprise Management 360, your main source for tech news, analysis, podcasts, and videos for the enterprise.
Welcome, everyone, to this EM360 podcast, where we'll have a weekly conversation with people who are impacting the enterprise tech landscape. My name is Zeus Kerravala. I'm the founder and principal analyst at ZK Research, and I'll be your host on this podcast. In today's episode, I'm joined by Jason Dover, Chief Product Officer at FileCloud, and we're here to discuss connecting your content collaboration and security strategy. Jason, welcome to the podcast, and just a quick bio on yourself.
Hey, Zeus, great to chat with you again. It's been a while, so happy to be here on the show. So I'm Chief Product Officer here at FileCloud. My background is in enterprise IT and technology, or in the financial industry. Then I transitioned over to the technology vendor space. I worked for the last decade or so across a variety of marketing strategy and product jobs. In this latest stint, I'm working here with FileCloud, driving forward our enterprise file sharing and sync strategy.
Yeah, and it's an interesting topic, right? Connecting your content collaboration and security strategy. Historically, the two were adjacent technologies, but people didn't often put them together. We'll be talking about that. But when you think of the world of enterprise file storage, right? It's certainly not a new industry, but it's gone through a lot of change over the last decade. Can you just talk about what trends have been shaping and evolving the overall content and collaboration space over the for the last few years?
Yeah, sure. I'd say it's certainly in a state of flux, right? One of the trends that have come up in the last several years are people looking to adopt some of the standards and approaches that you would find in public cloud ecosystems and start to bring them on premises as well into private cloud. And this is driving part of the modernization. As an example, things like object storage starting to leverage S3, connected with application modernization projects so that your on-premises apps and services look a bit more like what people became familiar with in Amazon, right, in AWS and Google. That's certainly one of the things that we see. A lot of the customers that we are engaging with, we're engaging with them because they're trying to modernize their ecosystem. Another trend that we're seeing a lot is that of a focus from Office of the CIO on trying to get more insights out of the data and the content that you have, right? And not just from structured data sources, but now also from unstructured data sources, which historically have been a bit more challenging. So this is driving customers to get a good inventory, get an understanding of what content you actually have inside of your environment such that you can start to extract intelligence in a systematic way. And this is what's driving people to start to move from a heterogeneous approach to a more homogeneous solution-based approach on how they actually organize their unstructured data within their environment. Of course, you can't forget, work from home and remote work. We're well past the experimental phase. This is a thing, right? It's here to stay. It's how organizations typically are going to operate. So this also brings in yet another kind of dimension of complexity. I need to make it easy for my folks to access the content and the data that they need, regardless of where they sit. I need them to be able to collaborate on that internally as well as with external partners. I also am likely, like everyone, increasing the amount of data and files and content that I have. So I've got this very, very wide surface area, and I have to manage all that. And that's ultimately where the point you mentioned at the outset around security comes into play, where it's not just a file SAE systems admin conversation anymore. When you're considering how you're organizing your file system and your ecosystem, it's now a security conversation, because what are threat actors after in the first place? It's not just to hijack the environment. Ultimately, it's to get at your files and your data and your content. And so that's where thinking about this through a lens of security becomes more important. I think the last piece of one of the core trends is, of course, now also with AI, and how can AI be leveraged to help to either monetize the data that you have hidden within your file and ecosystem, and also how do you leverage AI, again, for securing things, right? So how do I make sure that I understand what I have in the infrastructure, apply the right policies and so forth? These are the types of things that we're seeing customers bring to the conversations we're having with them of late.
Yeah, let's touch on some of those points. Let's start with AI, and we'll have a separate conversation on generative AI in a bit. But it's interesting since ChatGPT launched, everyone's been AI crazy. But in fact, companies like yourself have been using AI in these products for quite some time, correct? And can you describe how AI has changed the broader industry for companies like yourself?
The way that we look at it is maybe somewhat different than some organizations. We look at AI as one tool of many tools that can be leveraged to help solve specific challenges. We don't think that AI is going to solve all of technology's problems, no different than cloud, virtualization, containerization, software-defined X, et cetera, right? These are tools that have their appropriate applications. Now, of course, because of how fast AI has the potential of change and of evolution, I think that we will see the curve happen a lot quicker than some of the previous trends that have happened within the IT landscape. But in general, we say this is one tool. It has its application. We want to make it available for our customers to leverage in the right places, right? And so there's kind of two dimensions that we think about it as we look forward at our portfolio. One is how we leverage AI to connect with the broader ecosystem, right? So you take as an example a common scenario and set of actions that people leverage products like ours for, which is classification of content, right? So I've got all this distributed data on premises in the cloud in hosted environments. I also may have requirements for being compliant with certain standards, be it from the government or because of the industry that I operate in or because of the region that I operate in. And so I need to understand what's the actual content that I have. Do I have content that contains sensitive data, a sensitive IP of my users, my employees, and similar things? Now, there's multiple approaches. You could have a set of administrators looking at all the content and tagging it. You can write complex rules and develop basic scripts for classifying and content. You could leverage a large language model that can do that far more efficiently of looking through the content that you have, tagging it appropriately, and then helping to apply the right policies on how that content is handled. Don't share anything that has social security numbers. Simple use case, but you can imagine how that can get more complex. So that's kind of one aspect. We have some capabilities along those lines coming up in our next product release. The second aspect of how we think about AI in the product is how do we use AI to make the core of the product itself smarter? You may think that you have someone that is sharing a piece of content or sharing a file with someone else. Well, if I can interpret what the intent is, I may be able to make recommendations to that end user about other pieces of content that are related that also should possibly be shared. If that person says, yes, I can leverage AI to now go ahead and make some decisions to facilitate making the right content available for whatever the end purpose that you're trying to do is, right? So those are some examples of the types of things that we're thinking about for the future. With our latest iteration, we allow an end user to connect their FileCloud deployment with OpenAI. In future, we're going to be looking at things such as on-premises large language models that allows for organizations that have to keep everything inside the boundaries of their firewall. But we certainly see AI as having a core role as we think about the future. If we go back to the security angle, threat actors are leveraging AI. So if you want to be able to protect your environment, it only makes sense that you fight fire with fire. We think about the analogy of, a snake. You need the venom to make anti-venom, and that's kind of how we think about it. And so as we progress our roadmap, we're going to be looking at ways at how we can leverage AI more in the core of the product to help our customers protect their data and content.
A lot of IT pros are stuck in the old ways of doing things where they're still trying to, fight security and, ward off the bad guys using a lot of old manual methods and, old school tools. And I agree with the fight fire with fire. If the threat actors are using AI, the only way you can combat it is with AI, especially with your data, right? Finding that, that bad piece of data is like finding a needle in a stack of needles. So now staying on the topic of generative AI, what's the potential that brings to allow people to just interact with data differently?
That's a good question. I think it's kind of two-folded at least, right? There's probably even multiple dimensions to it, but let's stick with two for a second. If we think about the content lifecycle, the first part starts with authoring content, right? Today, customers have a very wide range of tools that they ultimately have to try to bring together in some sort of systematic way, right? From getting content generated, making sure it gets in the right place, making sure that the policies around it are controlled appropriately. The office of the CIO and CSO has to then make sure that that content that everyone's generating is only in the right hands, regardless of whether you've created this in Evernote or locally on your desktop or wherever. It's enterprise data, and I'm responsible for it, right, as centralized IT. When we think about that overarching life cycle, where I think the opportunity comes from is ultimately consolidation, right? We know that in various branches of IT, we go through these models of distributed technologies and then back to much more consolidation. I think we're going to see a trend moving back towards consolidation because it comes to control, right? Shadow IT is kind of out of control today, right? Down at the user level, but also at the IT level. It's far too easy for someone to simply swipe a credit card and now start sending your data externally, right, to services that are processing them. And ultimately the CIO has no idea what's going on. So I think that we will start to see solutions much more for delivering on-premises AI-based services with agents that are distributed across the ecosystem that helps with the centralized AT departments getting more control. And I think that that's important. It's not that you don't want to make services and capabilities available, but you have to ultimately be able to manage risk. And I think it's in this space that we'll start to see some of those things happening. Just to use an analogy, solutions like what we offer, well, one of the core purposes of them is to make it really, really easy for your end users to be able to share content, even potentially externally, no different than you would get from any number of cloud services that let you right-click a file and share out a link. The point is, I make that available for my end users, but I'm doing that with an overlay of control and of governance and of management and awareness. So I think that with the leveraging of generative AI and related technologies, it will become far easier for generating intelligence and insights out of the content that you have inside of your ecosystem, making it easier for your different departments to manage their own content lifecycle, including when things need to be published. But you'll have controls for central IT to make sure you're not doing anything that's too risky for the company. And that's broadly how we think about the future. That's how we centering our go forward direction is how do we make sure that IT is able to have the right controls and ensure that your data and your content only winds up in the right hands.
And I think the ability to interact with the data differently is pretty exciting too, because if you think historically, if I've got some data and I want to do some analysis on it, I'd have to hire likely a team of people to go do that analytics for me. And that could take weeks sometimes. And now with Gen AI, we'd like to get your thoughts on this. It should speed that whole process up, right? And even though we don't know what we're looking for, we can just prod it and ask some questions and then eventually be able to drill down on what we want. Am I thinking about that correctly?
Yeah, I agree with that as well. It's very easy if you've played with some of the models to throw some sample data out of it. And sometimes you get some surprising insights back. We're even looking at how do we leverage that in some of our internal processes and teams as well. And as we mentioned earlier, there is a big drive towards how do I get business insights out of my unstructured data sources as well. And so we certainly see this as one of the areas where Gen AI is going to be leveraged more, of making it easy to get those insights out of your unstructured data source. Look at the last 2 years of presentations we've prepared for the board, right? What was the underlying message that we were highlighting there? And now look at these other data sources and reports that I have. How are we actually comparing to what we said we were going to do from a qualitative perspective, right? Those are the types of things that historically you would have had to just assign an analyst to go and do for you. This can be Gen AI assisted, at least. You think about survey data where you have free-form text and you have already things such as being able to extract sentiment as an example. Well, this will give another dimension for organizations that are trying to understand the health of their employee base, their current state, how are the processes and the initiatives that we launched having an impact on the quality of employee experience and things like that. So I think that's going to be one of the biggest value props, and it already is happening, being able to extrapolate insights out of your unstructured data sources in far easier ways than you historically have, not having to hire a team of DBAs and analysts to do that.
Yeah, that's really exciting. Now, we had talked about the podcast is called Connecting Your Content Collaboration Security Strategy. And as companies have done that, have you found that they're thinking about their content collaboration a little differently? And what I mean by that is historically, you might have had one tool to do the file sync and share and another one to do the compliance. This concept I've thought about is the content collaboration lifecycle, if you will, especially as we're going to bring security in, needs to actually not just become something companies are thinking about, but they're actually doing. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Just starting kind of at the top, as we engage with customers, we certainly see more occasions where representatives from the office of the CISO are in the room, right? And they're part of the conversation. As we review RFPs, there typically is a huge section now that's dedicated to security and dedicated to compliance. So we're certainly starting to see that.
And historically, that was probably never the case, right? Where you would actually have a CISO with you.
This is a newer emerging trend.
Yeah.
And it's coming from this recognition that, well, this is your most valuable asset, right? Is your content that you have in your environment. And so any system you're entrusting it to, you have to make sure that it meets the policies of your ecosystem and aligns with your security risk tolerance levels there. As you just mentioned a moment ago, compliance as well is also converging quite a bit, right? More and more organizations are now coming under an umbrella where they have to be compliant. Elsewise, there's going to be some sort of financial implications, right? And of course, you have things like HIPAA, you have GDPR, but then you also have state level things happening in the Americas and also in nation states within the EU and the Middle East, where if you want to do business in that part of the world, or you want to do business in a specific industry there, you have to be compliant, right? Same thing we see here in the States of organizations that are doing business with the government and handling certain types of unclassified data where they have to be compliant with various NIST certifications, perhaps CMMC and the like. So that's certainly driving it. And you can tick a lot of boxes on these various standards by simply managing and deploying and configuring your file management ecosystem in the right way, right? And so we see customers engaging with us and looking to see how we can help them meet those standards. Now, of course, there's other parts of your physical infrastructure, access to the data centers, et cetera. It's part of this more holistic initiative, but there's a good percentage that you can cover off just by how you're managing access, which is also then why we're seeing the drive towards more integration with the ecosystem, right? So integration with your SIM system so that you're surfacing early indicators to potential issues, perhaps to ransomware or other attacks that's trying to be exploited. Customers looking to see how they can connect the dots with their XDR or their MDR systems as well, so that they can, again, enrich what's happening in the environment and where there's early warning signs with how this is actually connecting to potential access to their data system as well. And of course, integration with your authentication and identity systems, right? That's a huge problem that organizations have, that, okay, you cut off access to an employee that's exited as an example, but you have these systems that have their own authentication system set up, right? So ensuring that when I cut off the system for Jim because he's left and he's irate, he loses access to everything. Connecting those dots are certainly things that we see customers trying to do more and more of.
That was fascinating. This for people that really haven't looked at the space in a while, it's certainly not your father's content collaboration platform anymore. And that's I think that's one big takeaway here. Just one last question, Jason. With all the shift to the cloud and Gen AI and the integration of security, with all that happening and other trends coming, where do you see the future of enterprise file storage? Look into your crystal ball and tell us where this is going.
That's a good question. It's something I do spend a lot of time thinking about. If I think about the future, I first look back at the past, right? And back at the past at how different areas of technology have matured and morphed. And what typically happens is that you wind up with the features and the interfaces eventually evolving into being the underlying part of the infrastructure, the invisible part of the technology. And I think that's what will happen over time here as well, right? Right now, we're very fixed into how file systems are set up and data stores and so forth. And that's kind of a core part of what customers are looking at when they're trying to do some project. Over time, I think those things will matter a lot less, even as it's being talked about of how mobile apps at some point may look a lot different than what they do today. And what I think will happen is that when someone's interacting with a system, let's just say, they're going to define their intent of what they're trying to do, what they're trying to find out. All they're going to be concerned with is getting the results, whether that's in a file that exists in a local share on my Windows server over here, or it exists in an Azure S3 bucket over there, matters a lot less. And all that really matters is, are you surfacing the right content that's answering the question that I have, right? Now, of course, that infrastructure has to exist, no different than there's a lot of physical servers and infrastructure and cabling for the cloud. We talk about the cloud as it being this kind of a fluffy thing that's there, and it just kind of sits there above us. But really, there's a lot of tin and electricity and so forth. And it's going to take the same thing from vendors like us to make this possible. But what I think the world looks like in the future is that enterprise customers will get to care less about how the underlying glue all fits together. And they'll be able to focus a lot more on just surfacing the content that meets their end users' requests. That's kind of how I think about the future. Security is going to be a core part of it, because I need to ensure that responses to whatever requests are being put forth, well, those responses need to only go to people who actually have access and are authorized to get those answers. That's going to have to all come together. There's a lot of work to do, but that's how we kind of think about what the future looks like.
Well, that is pretty exciting, though, the ability to just interact with data as you need it instead of going through the painstaking methodologies we go through today. So, but I also know that we've all experienced, I think, hallucinations and deep fakes, and from a corporate standpoint, having that done with your data could be particularly damaging. So thanks for the peek into the future there as to where this is going. All right, Jason. So that was my last question. And I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you coming on. Also, thank you to everyone for listening. We hope you had a lot to take away from today's podcast. And for further information on what we've talked about, please head over to FileCloud.com. We'll be back next week with another episode in our podcast series. Until then, make sure you subscribe to this podcast on all major platforms, and you can also follow the conversation